Coming up for 10 to 8 this Friday morning, let's bring you this story now. As the net closes in on the Guptas, the NPA's investigating directorate is poised to secure the convictions of the family's business associate, Iqbal Sharma, and former Free State provincial government officials. The suspects face fraud and money laundering charges related to the failed Estina dairy farm project. Evidence of how millions of rand from state coffers were diverted to fake companies is at the center of the case. The Guptas are believed to have used the same methods to siphon funds from other state-owned entities. Now, this is a breaking story coming to you this morning. The extradition process will see the brothers and their wives facing the music, hopefully, after fleeing the country back in 2018. Last year, an exposé by Open Secrets and UK-based Shadow World Investigations laid bare the bankers, accountants and lawyers that cashed in on South Africa's state capture project. Open Secrets Director Hennie van Vuuren was one of the authors of the report. He joins us now via our video link in Cape Town. Hennie, it's been the breaking story we've been leading with since about 7 o'clock this morning, the ratification of those mutual legal assistance agreements between South Africa and the UAE coming into effect 10 July 2021. But it's not exactly clear sailing from here on.
Michelle, I think it's important to note, and good morning to you, this is not necessarily the good story we're wishing for. It's an important development, but it shows and highlights the intransigence of the Dubai government, the UAE government, their lack of interest in processing, firstly, the mutual legal assistance agreement, the extradition agreement. It's a 10-year process. We heard from Minister Ronald Lamola this morning. We know that it has been a process where the South African government and its parliament ratified those treaties as far back as 2018. So we've been sitting for 3 years waiting for the government of the United Arab Emirates to finally apply its mind and to sign and to ratify those agreements on its end, supposedly because they had a problem with translation along the way. I think there is good reason to believe that they were effectively, if you like, kicking for touch. They were trying to find a way to delay that process to ensure that there wasn't a speedy ratification. And I think that that is precisely something we can talk to, is the fact that, that Dubai and the UAE is a global hub for financial crime, for economic crime. There's an interest to protect this criminal status that the UAE enjoys and the profit that its government takes from it.
Sure.
And that unfortunately means that I think this 10 July date doesn't necessarily signal any fast movement on the horizon.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, Shamila Batoy going as far as to say these treaties don't actually change anything because there is a legal framework outside of this treaty. There is already an existing legal framework that would have enabled the UAE government to provide the kind of assistance that South Africa had been asking for.
Absolutely, Michelle. I think it was fortunately a little bit of straight talking from Shamila Batoy this morning, because she obviously is correct that South Africa, as is the UAE, a signatory to a 2004 Global Anti-Corruption Convention, United Nations Convention that all countries in the world have signed up to. And that should have allowed the speedy sharing of information, of bank records, which would have led ultimately to the potential extradition of the Guptas. And I think there's an enormous amount of pressure that's being placed on the UAE right now to try and spin this as well as they can. Let's not forget that we've seen major developments over the last 2 or 3 weeks. Firstly, we saw the new revelations around money flows, which Shadow World Investigations presented to the Zondo Commission. We now have an understanding that the Guptas stole, that means they didn't add any value to the economy, approximately $1 billion. It's about 15 billion rand from South Africa through state-owned enterprises. Much of that money was moved through United Arab Emirates, through Dubai, and now some of that money no doubt sits elsewhere. And then, of course, Michelle, this week, Iqbal Sharma's appearance finally in court. We know about the lavish lifestyle that he and his partner, Tarina Patel, have enjoyed, and how South Africans' elites have been part of enjoying their parties at their homes, which are recorded on social media. But there, too, we believe that is an amount of about, from what the NPA has revealed this week in its court papers, 250 million rand, which was stolen. And again, it seems that most of that money ended up in Dubai. And of course, just to add, Michelle, civil society organizations have been protesting outside the embassy of the UAE this week to put pressure on the government. So I think there's no coincidence. They're trying to get ahead of a problem with some good PR, but I think there'd be enormous amount of pressure that we as a society, that our government, that the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation need to be putting on a country like Dubai to stop harboring criminals and profiting from those crimes in the manner that it has consistently done over many years.
I mean, Hennie, break it down for our viewers who are trying to understand the story. I mean, first of all, that $15 billion you talk about, we're sitting in the midst of load shedding. I think we can think of one or two ways to fix the load shedding and the lack of water as just two problems that spring to mind immediately, the lack of water in our hospitals. But in terms of the UAE also being a signatory to this global anti-corruption convention, there's that one side of the story. On the other side, you're telling us the billions that the Guptas siphoned off from our country's economy flowed through Dubai itself. I mean, how do we square off on these two things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that $1 billion, or as you say, 15 billion rand, it does require an international system. It doesn't just happen overnight. You can't just move that cash. You can move it quickly, but you can't just put it in bags and fly through OR Tambo, as much as the Guptas may have wished to have done so. And so you need a global architecture of enablers, as as we've put it, to allow that to happen. And so this phase of state capture, very much like similar massive international crimes in other countries, rely on the role of a whole range of professionals, many of them who still sit in offices in London and in New York, and certainly are sitting in Sandton today in the big auditing offices, in the offices of law firms, and between them they constructed front companies. Those front companies are often in places like Bermuda. We know that some of the money that flowed through Trillion went through front companies that are there. They basically undertake no operation whatsoever. They exist in name, and they become a way, if you like, almost to imagine just shoveling cash offshore. You move as much of it off as quickly as you can, and then you disperse the cash through bank accounts across the world, and often it then comes back together in main bank accounts which are held in places like Dubai. The reason you go to a place like Dubai or Luxembourg, these are countries that have made vast amount of money off crimes, proceeds of crime, is that these are secrecy jurisdictions. They protect the people in different ways. And I think, Michelle, just to add, what we've seen here, the lack of willingness to deliver the Guptas, the amount of pressure the United States and now the United Kingdom are placing on the Guptas, despite that the UAE hasn't been moving, just shows that what they need to do in the instance of the Guptas is guarantee them the safe haven, because they need to guarantee a whole range of other criminals safe haven as well. If they release the Guptas and send them to South Africa overnight, it sends the wrong message to all that hot money that's invested in Dubai right now. So therefore the government there is caught in a bind, and that's what happens when you get entrapped by a network of criminals who you've given safe haven to.
So Hennie, in as much as we want to report on the story this morning and say that the net is closing in on the Guptas, the process from here is not that simple. I mean, what kind of timelines optimistically would we be looking at?
Yeah, so we've been given this timeline of 10th of July, which would be the next step where the law effectively comes into force in the UAE side of things. But Michelle, I think we've heard from the Director General this morning of Justice, who said to us we have cordial, normal relations with the country of the United Arab Emirates. The 15 billion rand that was stolen from South Africa, of which many of our politicians were part of and the enablers, has had, as you pointed out, massive social consequences. The fact that the lights are not on for many people this morning, that over 1 million people have had lost jobs, is directly linked to the issues of state capture. We should not have normal relations with an abnormal country. Right now, Michelle, South Africa continues to export weapons to the United Arab Emirates, which they are using, amongst others, to bomb innocent civilians in countries like Yemen. We have ties to this very abnormal, and if you like, some people have argued, a country that's based part of its economy on crime. And I don't think it's enough for the minister to sit there glibly and say, I went to the UAE 2 years ago, they flatly ignored me, and now I'm very happy that they've signed this document. He should be saying we are going to consider cutting economic ties with a country like the UAE for extended period to put the pressure on the government there to finally do something.
Yeah, absolutely. Hennie van Vuuren, Director of Open Secrets. It's always a bit of a mind bend talking to you. Thanks so much for your time this morning on